Alright, guys, so hopefully you guys are good to go with all the assignments and everything I gave you yesterday, and there is a purpose to those. I understand there's a purpose that you're not going to like, but I actually have my reasons. I'm not just trying to give you busy work. But nobody sent me emails, so far so good, but if you do have questions, feel free to email me. With that being said, now we need to get on to the notes. So civil liberties, like we talked about yesterday, or I talked about, and you guys got to listen to, civil liberties are those things that are protected in the Bill of Rights. They're clear as day. They're established. They're protected in the Constitution. Hey, they didn't come later. They were there from day one. Doesn't mean they were always enforced. Doesn't mean that they were always understood, but they were there. Your freedoms that are under that. You just kind of got done watching a video with the gentleman talking, giving you a nice little overview. He actually ends up going on for like an hour on civil liberties, but I'm not going to make you watch that whole thing. Okay, so as we take notes and we look at this, what I'm going to do is give you some time to write it down and then kind of talk. Mr. Wolf can pause things if I go a little too fast as needed. Just, let him know what's going on. Okay, so civil liberties. We're going to look at the basis of our civil liberties: First Amendment freedoms, property rights, due process rights, privacy rights, rights of criminals, and then protecting our civil liberties in the age of terrorism. Kind of talking about that because that's specific today. And then the one that's not on here is people power and state powers, protecting the rights of the people and the powers. So I'll give you a minute to copy this all down. Like I said, ask if you need it to be paused. Alright, so I'm going to move on. If you need to be paused or brought back up, I'll let Mr. Wolf handle that. So this was the video we already watched. Don't need to watch it again. So why do court cases matter so much? So what I want you to do here is actually, I don't want you to write anything down. I just want you to listen to me. And then I'll let Mr. Wolf pause it. I think it'll actually work better this way when there's so much up here. I'll let Mr. Wolf pause it and tell him to pause it, and then we can move on, so on and so forth. Okay, so why do these cases matter? So I gave you a ton of cases that you have to look at. You guys are furious with me. You hate life. You hate me. But there's a reason for it. Because we have to understand that without the court cases, we wouldn't understand what the Bill of Rights means. Okay? Because when the Bill of Rights was written, you got freedom of speech. You got freedom of the right to bear arms. You got this freedom, that freedom. That was great, but it was on paper. It wasn't in the real world. So over time, people did something, and the government said, no, we're not going to let you do that. And then people said, well, wait a second. In the Bill of Rights, I have this protection. I'm allowed to do this. And so what did they have to do? They had to go to the courts. And they would go to the courts, and they would explain their side, and the government would explain their side. And the courts would interpret the meaning of what that meant, whatever the situation was. And that court ruling is the interpretation. Okay, so regardless of if it's 200 years old or it's 15 days old, the court ruling is how we decide what the Founding Fathers, what our Constitution means in this day and age. Okay, as times change, we've seen court cases change. And two of the court cases that you have to look up: Plessy v. Ferguson, Brown versus the board. Plessy v. Ferguson, separate but equal, A-OK. Whites and blacks don't need to be together. Okay, Brown versus board, separate but equal, wrong. Not acceptable because separate means inherently unequal and blacks were being discriminated against. Okay, so things change, times change. Plus you have this whole element of we don't know what tomorrow holds. So George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Adams, all of those gentlemen, they had no clue what television was, what the radio was, what the internet was. So how did they know what freedom of speech meant in those worlds? Now, their ideas may apply equally. Their ideas may not apply to those circumstances. Your right to privacy. Okay, how do we deal with terrorism versus defending against the English army coming across for a month and a half on boats, landing on the shores that we can see? How do we balance your rights with dealing with these situations that have never been seen before? And that's where the courts come in. Okay, and that's where they're going to look at the situation, they're going to analyze the case history, they're going to analyze the event or circumstances, and they're going to make that decision of what does this matter, how does this apply. Okay, and we don't always agree. The Americans do not always agree on how a concept is applied in day-to-day life. We struggle with this. Some people feel one side, other people feel the other, and the courts have come in and said, no, in the eyes of the government, this is what it means. Okay, this is what we're saying. So like you guys, as students, owe a lot to Tinker. Okay, the Tinker kids, what they did, and this is one of your cases too, is they wanted to protest the Vietnam War. Now think about that. Vietnam War is in the 60s. They wanted to protest the Vietnam War by wearing a simple armband. Well, we have never seen kids protest in public schools. When George Washington and John Adams and them were looking at, the freedom of speech, they didn't know what public schools were going to look like in 1950, 1960, today. And so we didn't know how to apply that. And then you have this element that back then kids were to be seen but not hurt. Well, now we respect your rights to a degree. Obviously, you don't have full protection of the Constitution that you'll have when you're a full adult, but we respect them a lot more. They protested in a way that didn't disrupt anything, didn't cause any problems. The principal said, wait, I don't like what you guys are doing here. That is wrong. And a lot of Americans completely agreed with that principle and said these kids are just being a bunch of curmudgeons. They have no business speaking up the way that they are. They are going beyond their rights. That is not allowed. They should not be able to do that. They should know their place. Kids are seen but not heard. And the courts came back and said no. If they're not disrupting the learning environment, kids have a right to express their opinions just like adults do. Okay, but there's that key part. They can't disrupt the learning environment. So there are a few more restrictions on kids than adults in different situations there. Okay, so for the most part, the courts settle the issues. Now, that well to a degree. You have things like abortion. You have things like flag burning. You have things that a lot of us don't see eye to eye on, and politicians will play into that. So even though the court may rule on something, there's always that possibility that the court can change their mind. And regardless of whether or not they ever change their mind, politicians and people in our government can interpret things differently. And then we see new cases come up and new cases come up. So just like we're seeing, the abortion case in the 70s, now we're seeing a couple new cases come up that are dealing with these issues and challenging the state's rulings. That's what I mean by well to a degree. It's never going to be a settled issue. Okay, one of the big rulings that just came out yesterday is that they ruled that an Alabama law that banned same-sex marriage or same-sex couples from adopting a kid was unconstitutional. Now you think about that. So if you have two gay guys or two lesbian women that are in a relationship and they try to adopt a kid, some states have said, yeah, that's fine. You just have to go through the process, get married, just like we would hold you to the same standards of a straight couple. And other states have said, nope, that's detrimental to kids. We're not going to allow that. And the Supreme Court struck down that ruling. That ruling would not have happened 20 years ago, let alone 50 or 200 years ago. So there's always that element of change of what's going on. Okay, so as we go through this and as we look at these different rulings, you're going to hear me talk a lot about situations. You're going to hear me talk a lot about different cases, and that's why you need to know them, because they are going to appear on the test. But more importantly, without the cases, we wouldn't understand how these rules are supposed to be applied in day-to-day life. So if Mr. Wolf needs to pause this, I'm going to go ahead and stop for a couple seconds. He can pause it, and then we'll pick up. And if you hear the little kid in the background, that's my daughter. She's upstairs supposed to be going to bed and singing a go-go song. So she's rooting for somebody. But, all right, I'm going to move on. Hopefully you guys got what you needed. If not, like I said, Mr. Wolf can pause it or he can come back to it. All right. So where do our civil liberties come to? Well, you have the original Constitution. Okay, so in the Constitution, we have some of our civil liberties. And I've mentioned some of these. Writ of habeas corpus. Now, this is an important one. You do need to know what this term means. Okay, so writ of habeas corpus is the idea that if you're locked away and you don't know why you're charged, you can file a writ of habeas corpus and you're brought before a judge, and the judge has to explain why are you there, and the police have to explain why you've been arrested, and if they can't satisfactorily charge you in front of that judge, you're freed. We don't allow for people to be locked up and the key thrown away. This was ruled unconstitutional. This was the basis of an action that Abraham Lincoln had ruled unconstitutional. He locked up the Confederate soldiers and would not try them. Now, they were still American citizens. Abraham Lincoln was stuck in a no-win in this situation. He wanted the country to stay together. So in order to sit there and keep the country together and justify that he was just dealing with slavery and a rebellion, he had to acknowledge that all of the Southern soldiers fighting were still American citizens. So he got them stuck in this situation where he claimed that they were citizens, he claimed that we were still one country, so the Constitution still applied to him. But he did not want these captured soldiers to run back to the South and keep fighting against the North. And he didn't want to try them and have them executed for treason. So he went ahead and just suspended writ of habeas corpus, said, I'm not going to say, I'm locking you up until the end of the war. You're not going to get tried. You're not going to go through any of that. We're not going to do that. And the Supreme Court later came back and said, you can't do that. Now, if he would have executed every one of those soldiers, we would have had a way worse problem with Reconstruction. He would have freed every one of those soldiers. They would have went back and continued fighting. So he went ahead and did this, and then the Supreme Court came back and said, no, you're not allowed to do that. Luckily, we have not had a civil war since, so this has not become an issue ever again. But that is in the Constitution. Ex post facto is that you cannot punish somebody for a law after the fact. So if we create a law that makes something illegal, and you do that action today, and tonight at 11:59, or I'm sorry, 12:01, whatever, it becomes illegal, you're free and clear. You can only get punished if you break the law when the law said it was illegal. Okay, you can't get punished after the fact if we change a law or we do that. And this can be very, very frustrating. And this can be extremely frustrating with new technology because there's things today that are not on the book that we're going to realize are horrible, horrible things, and then we're going to make them illegal. But the people that do them today that make us realize they're horrible, horrible things, they're going to get away from them. Okay. Where this comes into play recently is something that's called revenge pornography. Okay, revenge pornography is where if you're in a relationship and you take pictures and very bad, well, I don't want to say bad, but very sexual nature pictures of your person you're in a relationship with, after they break up with you, you post them to the internet. Okay, that was never illegal. And so when you had some bitter boyfriends or bitter girlfriends that shared those pictures to adult sites and spread that picture of that person all over the world for them to be seen in a private picture that was only meant for one person at the time, that was not a crime. We didn't realize that that could happen. And so they passed laws where that is now illegal, but anybody that did it before it became illegal, they got away with it. And you had people's lives that were ruined. Okay, imagine being 22, 23-year-old. You break up with somebody for whatever reason, and then you can't get a job because the people in the room, when they did their Google search of your name, up popped a picture of you that you sent to your boyfriend and thinking that it was in private. Okay, that is something that I think we all agree is illegal. But it took a while for us to realize that that was happening and then to make it illegal. And then you have the Bill of Rights in the states. So we have two big concepts that we have to understand. Due process. That means as American citizens, as citizens of our states, as students in this school, you are always guaranteed to be treated with a set process that cannot be violated. There are always going to be steps. Those steps have to happen. Doesn't mean they're always going to be the same. Doesn't mean the outcome's always going to be the same. You always have the same trial steps, whether you commit murder, whether you commit theft. But the outcome, the significance, how those steps are carried out are going to be different through that process. And that's what due process is all about, is everybody is treated the same. And then you have selective incorporation. So selective incorporation comes from the 14th Amendment. And one of the key parts of the 14th Amendment says that states have to treat people as members of all the states or citizens of the United States. And so if a state has to treat us all as citizens of the United States, that means that all federal rights, all federal interpretations of the law apply to everybody. And this was because of slavery. So this is where we see the end of slavery, that it doesn't matter if you're white, you're black, you're male, you're female. The rule applies to you from the federal government, not just in the northern states, not just in western states, but in every state. So if one state says, well, I don't care what the federal government does, I don't like gay marriage, well, under the 14th Amendment, gay marriage has now been ruled a universal marriage right. So those states that are trying to fight it, resist it, they are not going to be allowed to. And we'll explain more with selective incorporation right after Mr. Wolf goes ahead and hits play on the next video. So I'm going to give about 5 seconds when I stop talking for Mr. Wolf to pause this if you guys need to write this down. And then he's going to stop this and put up the next video.